Hey there! This video is going to be all about the Canon R5 II versus the Canon R5C. Now, I've been wanting to make this video for a while, but I've been busy with other stuff, and I actually wanted to put more time on the R5 II before pulling my thoughts together to make this video. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Josh, and on this channel, I focus on deep dive technical reviews and comparisons, and I also do tutorials, and I am also very much video focused. I'm not much of a photographer. So if you're into that kind of stuff, then you're in the right place. Also, I do want to mention that I purchased both of these cameras with my own money, so this video is not sponsored or influenced in any way. These are all my own opinions. And if you value that sort of thing, maybe hit subscribe. All right. These cameras are a lot closer than I thought they would be. I think when the R5 II was announced and when it came out, I think a lot of us were hoping that there'd be a big difference in image quality, dynamic range, and all that kind of stuff. And there are some subtle differences, which I will talk about in this video, but overall, they're pretty similar. Now, I kind of wanted to make this video more of a discussion with all of you guys and really think about, why you'd want to choose both cameras, and I will get into that. But then I decided I should probably include some technical, nerdy stuff to compare with you guys. So I have made 2 videos like that so far, testing dynamic range and low light between these 2 cameras, and I'll leave those videos linked down below. And like I said, I focus on video, so if you're interested in the photography aspects of these 2 cameras, I will not be covering that in this video. There are lots of other channels and creators that have covered those things because the R5C is essentially an OG or Mark I R5 minus IBIS. And so if you look at the R5 versus the R5 II, you'll get information about those in terms of photography. So first of all, let's talk about image quality between these 2 cameras. Both of these cameras have amazing image quality. I've used the R5C extensively over the past few years, basically since it came out. And I've been using the R5 II since it came out at launch, and I've been really impressed with it as well. In the real world, I personally don't see too much of a difference in terms of image quality between these 2 cameras when I'm actually shooting and editing and grading all the footage. There are some differences in terms of dynamic range, which we will look at in a bit. But I think the first thing to talk about are the differences in specs between these 2 cameras. And the biggest one is going to be C-Log 2 versus C-Log 3. Now, if you're not familiar with the differences, C-Log 2 will have a potential for more dynamic range, both in terms of the highlights and the shadows. Now, everyone has been upset about the fact that Canon has never added C-Log 2 to the R5C, myself included. I made a video about Canon log curves and why Canon hasn't put C-Log 2 in the R5C, and I'll leave that video linked down below as well. Now, the R5C, let me be clear, does not shoot C-Log 3. You can shoot RAW, and then interpret the footage as either C-Log 2 or C-Log 3 in your NLE. And I'll show you the differences with some images in this video. And if you're shooting in the non-RAW codecs on the R5C, you will only have C-Log 3 as an option, whereas you can get C-Log 2 in the compressed codecs on the R5 II. All right, so let's look at some examples. All right, so here's a basic example to just take a look at the images out of these 2 cameras. We have the R5 II on the left and the R5C on the right. Both of these are recorded with the same exposure, with the same lens, and both recorded in 8K RAW and interpreted as C-Log 2 in post. These 2 images have been graded, and you can see that they look very, very similar to each other, and it's really hard to tell the difference between them, and I think you can cut between them pretty easily. Here it is right out of camera. Again, these were both interpreted as C-Log 2 in post. You can see there's some differences here, but of course these are different cameras, and we're recording in RAW, so we can get the full capabilities out of the sensor. And this is once you interpret R5C as C-Log 3, you can see there's a little bit of a difference. This is done in post. Of course, the same image being recorded here. You can see the black point's been lifted. That's a C-Log 2 versus C-Log 3 thing. And going back to the graded images, like I said, these are very, very similar to each other. And even if you look at the details in the highlights and the shadows, they're pretty similar in terms of their performance. Again, a real life test here. They do look pretty similar and, easy to match. Next, we have another shot of these 2 cameras recorded in 8K RAW and interpreted as C-Log 2. And here it is after grading. These images look really similar. Even if you look at the highlight roll-off or performance and you look at the leaves and the bright spots on the grass, they're pretty similar. I think these cameras do perform pretty similarly out in the real world. So like I said at the beginning of the video, I did make a detailed video comparing the dynamic range of these 2 cameras, and if you're interested in more of those details, I'll leave that video linked down below for you to check out. Here's some footage that I captured with the 2 cameras and showed in that video. We have the R5 II on the left and the R5C on the right. This is graded. These are recorded in the 4K compressed codecs in C-Log 2 and C-Log 3. Of course, you can definitely see a difference here with C-Log 2 versus C-Log 3. They have different amounts of contrast with the black point being lifted on the C-Log 3. Here it is again after it was graded. I think overall, these cameras, like I said, capture similar amounts of dynamic range. There's going to be a difference in the shadows, which we'll take a look at. There's also differences in the colors. Here it is, the same images, but I actually raised up the shadows so you could see them a little bit better. There's definitely a difference in the shadows. You can see that on my shirt there. It's noisier, and you get these horizontal banding, and we'll take a look at that with the window test. All right, so here's the window test, and this is one of the ways I like to compare the dynamic range of cameras. Basically, I expose for the highlights, and then I look at the shadows. The highlights look very similar here if you look out through the window, since both are interpreted as C-Log2, but the shadows definitely look worse on the R5C. You got that horizontal banding, which I've definitely demonstrated in several other videos. The chroma noise is more magenta on the R5II and more green on the R5C. Now zooming in, you can see that the noise is pretty apparent on the R5C in the shadows, and I would give a small advantage here to the R5II. I think it definitely shows more dynamic range in the shadows, and remember this is recorded in RAW and interpreted as C-Log2 to keep it as fair as possible. So really looking at the differences between the sensors here. Remember there's no noise reduction applied here because these were both shot in RAW. Next, let's take a look at the 4K fine or oversampled modes in both cameras, and we're looking at the compressed codecs here, and of course C-Log2 on the left and C-Log3 on the right, because that's what these two cameras can do. Overall, pretty similar to the 8K RAW test. I'd say the highlights here look slightly better on the R5II, again C-Log2 versus C-Log3. The colors look more natural, maybe even slightly green on the R5II. The R5C pushes a bit more magenta. The shadows look better on the R5II, and zooming in, you can see the difference in the shadows. I'd say that there is a subtle difference in the shadows like we saw in the RAW. Not a huge difference, but I have to give a little bit more dynamic range advantage to the R5II in the shadows, and we get that slightly better highlight roll-off in this extreme example. But out in the real world, I didn't really see as much of a difference. Next, let's look at the low light performance on these two cameras. And like I said earlier, if you're looking for a detailed comparison, I made a video about that, and I'll leave that link down below for you to check out. As you can see from these shots, the R5II definitely performs pretty well in the higher ISO range in a real world situation. This, of course, is the oversampled 4K mode, which definitely helps with the noise. The R5II has an informal dual base ISO of 800 and 4000, whereas the R5C has a formal dual base situation at 800 and 3200. And we will take a look and compare those two cameras. All right, here we are comparing the two cameras, starting off at ISO 1600. I want you to take a look at the dual base ISOs. So on the R5C on the right here, you'll see it cleaning up going from 2500 to 3200 right here. And on the R5II on the left, once it hits 4000 right here, you'll see it clean up. Now above that range, both cameras I think perform pretty similarly, both in terms of lumen noise and chroma noise. Now these tests here were shown with the noise reduction turned off, and it's really great that you can change the noise reduction in camera. If you're curious about how the noise reduction affects the images in camera, check out that other video, like I mentioned, linked down below. But both these cameras, I don't consider them to be low light specialists, but it's nice having that second base ISO at 3200 and 4000. I think that's very handy for a lot of situations. And if you get up a little bit higher, they're not awful, and they do clean up pretty well in post with some noise reduction. So overall, I think the two cameras do perform pretty well in terms of their high ISO or low light capabilities. Next, let's talk about the sensor readout speed or the rolling shutter performance of these two cameras. Now, I got some really interesting results to share with you, and the reason why they're interesting is that the R5II has a stacked sensor, whereas the R5C and the R5 Mark I do not have a stacked sensor. Now, generally, stacked sensors will give you a quicker readout speed of the sensor, giving you less rolling shutter artifacts. But that's not the case here, and it's really interesting. So take a look at the results. The 8K RAW on the R5II, I got 16.6 milliseconds. And the 8K RAW on the R5C, I actually got 15.6 milliseconds, which is actually less than the R5II. And this is really weird. I wouldn't say it's a huge advantage, 1 millisecond readout speed, but the fact that the R5II is not better than the R5C, it's kind of weird because it has a stacked sensor. So I checked this in some other modes. When the R5II was in the 4K 24 fine mode, again, I got 16.6 milliseconds, same as the 8K RAW. And the R5C, I got 15.4 milliseconds, was just slightly faster, but basically within the margin of error. And I also want to check out some of the other modes in the R5II. So I measured the 4K SRAW, and I got 16.7 milliseconds, which was pretty much the same as the 8K RAW and the 4K 24. So it's actually seems like it must be pulling in all of the information from the sensor and doing some sort of computation with that, whereas I thought it was some sort of line skipping or pixel bin thing. That's for another whole discussion. But anyways, the 4K non-fine mode on the R5 II did get reduced to 9.1 milliseconds. So when you are doing that line skipping or pixel binning or whatever method they use, you do get a quicker readout. And the R5C is oversampled up to 4K 60, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So to get it to not use the oversampling mode on the R5C, I tested it in 4K 120 and I got 7.5 milliseconds. So basically in all of the corresponding modes with line skipping or not line skipping or whatever, the R5C actually performs slightly better than the R5 II, even the fact that the R5 II has a stack sensor. And these aren't huge advantages, like I said, but the fact that it's not better is definitely interesting. Next, let's talk about battery life, because what video about the R5C would not include talking about its battery life? Now, most of us know that the R5C does not have great battery life, but with the new battery that came in the R5 II, the new LPE6P, I picked up a few with the R5 II and I tested it in the R5C, and I made a video about that with a whole bunch of runtimes. I'll leave that video linked down below if you want to check out more details, but it definitely increased the runtime. So when I ran the R5C in the 4K 24 mode, which is oversampled, I got 1 hour and 32 minutes with the power saving mode turned off. Now, generally, when I run this camera with the LPE6NH battery, I got about an hour. So definitely get a huge increase in runtime. In my opinion, getting an hour and a half runtime on a camera like the R5C makes this a lot more usable in a lot of situations and a lot more competitive with the other cameras on the market. Now, the R5 II doesn't have a fan, and so I anticipated it running longer. And when I ran the R5 II in the same mode, the 4K 24 fine mode, it only ran for 1 hour and 15 minutes, which was actually less than the R5C, using the same battery, charged the same way with very similar settings. And so this was a very interesting result to me. I definitely thought the R5 II would run closer to like an hour 45 or 2 hours like it has in some of the other Canon mirrorless cameras, but it doesn't. So in terms of battery life, the R5C is actually slightly better than the R5 II. Is that 15 minutes difference enough to make you want to use one camera or the other? Not really, but the fact that the R5C gets so much hate for its battery life has now been sort of negated with the new battery. Of course, you have to buy new batteries, but just want to report that the battery life is actually better on the R5C than the R5 II. Next, let's talk about some similarities. Both these cameras have a full frame 45 megapixel sensor with an RF mount. They have very similar body designs. Really, the only difference is going to be the fact that there's a fan sticking out on the back, but otherwise they're very, very similar between the two cameras. They both have the same 3.2-inch, 2.1 million dot LCD screen that flip and rotate. The EVFs are both half an inch, and they have similar resolutions as well. So physically, these cameras are very similar. So let's talk about the differences. I think one of the biggest ones for me personally is going to be the cooling on these two cameras. Now, most of you know that the R5C has a built-in fan, and you can run this camera in any codec, frame rate, resolution, temperature, environment, situation, rigging, not rigging. This camera will not overheat because it has a built-in fan. It's a cinema camera in the video mode, and it is just a really reliable camera. So if you're looking for a camera that will just run and run and run, never overheat, don't have to worry about it, this is definitely an advantage for the R5C. Now, the R5 II can definitely overheat, and I made a detailed video about overheating and runtimes and stuff like that, link down below. You can also get the cooling grip for this, which is $400 and definitely increases runtimes, but you can still get the camera to overheat in a lot of modes, and it does add bulk and more rigging and stuff like that. So if you are definitely needing a camera that is very reliable, long run times, any situation, the R5C is a huge advantage. And for me personally, I've been using the R5 II a lot lately in the studio, like for an overhead camera and stuff like that. And the camera will overheat, and I have to keep an eye on it and shut the camera down and stuff like that. And that distracts me from making content. And that's in an environment like this, shooting in 4K 24, where it's not that warm in here. So again, cooling, big advantage for the R5C. Do not have to worry about it. The next one is 4K 60. I know most of you know about this, the fact that the R5C is oversampled in 4K 60, and the oversampling stops at 4K 30 on the R5 II. Now, this may or may not be a big deal for you, depending on how much you use higher frame rates and where you're delivering it to. And I've shot both of these cameras in 4K 120 before, and they do look awesome. But if you live in 4K 60, that could be a huge difference for you. For example, when I shoot real estate, I live in 4K 60, so I want to have the best image quality possible. Now, Most clients probably won't know the difference, but when you are shooting one mode over and over and over again, I want to try to get the best possible image quality. And there's definitely a difference between the oversampled 4K modes and the line skip modes in these cameras. So again, I've shot in up at 60 and 120 on this camera, and it does look really good, but that is a big difference between these two cameras. I do think that the R5 II is capable of recording in 4K 60, and I do hope that Canon puts out in a future firmware update. I think the camera will overheat a lot faster, and we'll have to deal with that, but it's in the menu, it's just grayed out. So I do hope they add that in a firmware update. The next one, of course, is the big C-Log 2 versus C-Log 3 thing. Of course, if you're recording in RAW, you can interpret the R5C as C-Log 2, but if you're recording in the compressed codecs, you are stuck to C-Log 3 on the R5C. Like I showed earlier, you do get a little bit more dynamic range in the R5 II, so you have to weigh that and see if that's worth it for you. I'd rather shoot in C-Log 2, but we're not going to get that on the R5C. The next one is the cinema operating system that you get when you're shooting video on the R5C versus the stills operating menu that you get in the R5 II. Now, they have added a few things in the R5 II, like the custom picture stuff that you get in the R5C. But for me personally, I'll just give you my bias here and my preference that I really do like the cinema operating system better. And the reason for that is you get things like SNF mode, and it's really handy because you can customize all the frame rates. It also slows it down in camera, which is fantastic because when you're on set, you can show the client what it's actually going to look like slowed down. You can actually verify the speed at which you do a movement or something like that. You don't have to guess. Maybe it looked too slow or too fast, and you could do the shot again. Also, you don't have to then slow it down in post, which saves you time. There is the high frame rate mode, but it's only for certain frame rates, and it locks you into 30 frames per second, where this is a lot more flexible and has a lot more options. We also have shutter angle, which is awesome on the R5C. The false color implementation is not great on the R5 II because you have to turn off view assist, and you can't actually set one of the custom buttons to do that. So you have to go in the menu, turn view assist off, then turn false color on. You can't have peaking on either. So when the R5C, I have two buttons on the back, one set for false color, one for peaking. I can just hit them on and off as I'm working. It's just a lot faster. Overall, the R5C is just really geared more towards video production. And I know that's not a surprise. This is labeled a cinema camera. It's got the little red button and the C badge. But if you're using this for video, this camera, in my opinion, makes a lot more sense. You might have your own preferences on the two operating systems, but once I got comfortable shooting on the R5C and the C70 and those cameras, I really do prefer this. The stack sensor on the R5 II could be an advantage in photography. Again, I don't really do much photography, but in terms of video, really not much of a difference, like I said before. The R5 II has a full-size HDMI port, which is awesome. We all know the R5C does not have a full-size HDMI port. We've all been working with it. It's not the best, but that's a big advantage for the R5 II. Next, let's talk about IBIS. Now, IBIS is a pro or a con depending on which camp you live in and what you're doing. My opinion about IBIS has changed over time. I think depending on what you're doing, like I said, for me personally, the R5 II, if I'm doing things like wildlife, street video, travel stuff, I love the IBIS for video. But for most other things, I'd rather have a camera that does not have IBIS and the sensor is pinned. And the reason I like that is you don't get any of that wobbly, warpy stuff on wide-angle lenses. If you have more control over the image, you're not letting the computer and the camera, sort out some stuff. You can put this on a gimbal. You can mount this in different ways. I've had really great results using this camera with stabilized RF lenses with the digital stab in the camera. So there's pros and cons of IBIS. There's a lot of situations nowadays where I don't want IBIS in a camera and you have more control over it. Also, if you put a bunch of weight on the R5C and you're hand holding the camera, you get more of that sort of handheld cinema look and not have those like warpy stuff that you can sometimes get with IBIS. So pros and cons, I wouldn't say having it is better or worse. The R5C also has timecode. It has dedicated timecode port, which is really handy when you're working on set with multiple cameras or you're doing multiple angles and that sort of stuff. Having timecode is absolutely huge. Now, there's a difference in autofocus between these two cameras. They have a very different system. Of course, the R5C uses the Cinema OS and the R5 II uses the Stills OS. The R5 II has their newest and greatest autofocus systems and algorithms, has a lot more subject detection modes, different animals and vehicles and stuff like that. The R5C is much more simple, but there's one thing in the R5C which I love is in the C70 and their other cinema cameras is that face-only autofocus mode. It's really handy for talking heads and stuff like that, but overall the autofocus is going to be a lot more usable in a lot more situations on the R5 II. Next is the AK60. If you are into shooting AK60, you need to plug in USB-C power delivery on the R5C to enable that with anything other than like a fully manual lens. And with the R5II, you don't need to do that. The next biggest difference, and the last one I want to talk about between these two cameras, is the price. There's a big price difference. Now, the R5II did come out somewhat recently, so it's still full price at $4,300. But at the time of recording this, the R5C is selling for $3,400, which is a big difference. That's $900. Now, everyone has some sort of budget, and if you're buying one or maybe multiple cameras, $3,400 is a lot more attractive than $4,300. Also, the R5C has been out for a while. You can definitely find them on the used market for under $3,000, which is awesome. So it's definitely something to consider. Now, when the R5C came out, I think it listed at $4,500. It went up to $4,800 at one point, which I thought was ridiculous. And then it's been marching its way back down over the last few years. So I think there's a lot of value in $3,400. $4,300 is getting pretty pricey. Of course, everyone's budget is different. All right, so let's talk about which camera you should buy. Who should buy the R5II? I think overall it's a better hybrid camera because the fact that you have IBIS, you have the newer autofocus, and all the upgraded stills capabilities that you get going from like the R5 Mark I to the R5 Mark II. It has better autofocus, has that subject detection modes for animals and other things. And like I said, if you're more of a hybrid shooter, I think the R5II is a better camera. Now, who should buy the R5C? Someone who is more video focused, someone who needs a reliable camera for long form recording. You need time code, you prefer the cinema operating system, and maybe you really put a lot of weight on the oversampled 4K 60. It's also significantly cheaper. The main things you're giving up going for the R5C over the R5II is the full-size HDMI port, C-Log 2, IBIS, which is a pro or con depending on what you're doing, and then the autofocus stuff. So those are sort of the details outlined here. Let me talk about my personal experience. Having used the R5II since it came out, like I said at the beginning, I was hoping for it to be a big leap in image quality, dynamic range, and stuff like that over the R5C. The longer I use the R5II, the more I'm realizing these two cameras are similar, and I went out for a real estate shoot a few weeks ago, and I planned to grab the R5II, and last minute I actually grabbed the R5C because of the cinema operating system, the SNF mode, and things like false color and all the other things I mentioned before. I actually work faster on this camera in a professional videography or filmmaking sense than I do on the R5II because of the menus. So it's really up to you. For me personally, like I also said, the cooling is a big difference for me because I just do not have to think about it. I always say I'm a fan of fans. So if you're shooting video, I really do recommend having cameras that have dedicated, built-in active cooling because you don't have to think about it. Anyways, hopefully this outlined a lot of this stuff for you. There's no right answer. I'm very lucky that I'm able to have both and I can use them in different situations as my needs change. But I wanted to make this video because it's been a long time coming and a lot of people are interested in my thoughts on these two cameras. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit subscribe if you're not already, and we'll see you in the next one.